My name is Sarah Jennings, and exactly 1 minute before my little sister walked down the aisle, my FBI fiancé grabbed my wrist hard enough to make me spill champagne down the front of my dress and whispered, "We need to leave right now. She is not safe." At first, I honestly thought he was joking. I remember staring at him like he had entirely lost his mind. The wedding coordinator was already lining up the bridesmaids outside the heavy oak ballroom doors. String music floated through the old naval club overlooking Charleston Harbor. Somebody nearby smelled like expensive cigars and sea salt, and there I was, standing in 4-inch heels holding my sister's bouquet while my fiancé looked ready to pull a fire alarm. "This is not funny, David," I hissed, trying not to smile too hard in front of the mingling guests. "I'm not joking." That was the exact moment my stomach tightened, because David Miller wasn't a dramatic man. In the 3 years I had known him, the man barely raised his voice when ordering coffee. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows overlooking the marina. Sailboat lights flickered ominously on the black water. Inside, everything looked warm, polished, and expensive enough to make normal people nervous. My sister Chloe loved that kind of thing. Crystal chandeliers, thousands of white roses imported from somewhere ridiculous. Waiters carrying tiny crab cakes on silver trays that nobody actually ate. The whole weekend had felt less like a wedding and more like a carefully rehearsed theatrical performance, and somehow I had convinced myself that it was normal. "Sarah," David lowered his voice even more, "please trust me." I glanced toward the bridal suite down the hallway. Chloe had asked me 10 minutes earlier if her veil looked crooked. I had fixed it myself while she stared into the mirror like she was studying a stranger's face. At the time, I told myself she was just nervous. Everybody gets nervous before weddings, right? Then I looked back at David. He wasn't panicked. That almost scared me more. He looked intensely focused, controlled, like he had already made a catastrophic decision and hated every single second of it. "What happened?" I whispered. "I'll explain in the car." "No, you don't get to drag me out of my sister's wedding without telling me why." A group of Julian's relatives brushed past us, laughing loudly, smelling like high-end bourbon and inherited arrogance. Old Savannah money. The Vance family practically carried themselves like minor royalty all weekend. Julian, especially. My future brother-in-law had one of those polished southern smiles that always seemed half a second late reaching his eyes. The kind of man who called women sweetheart in public and made it sound less like affection and more like ownership. I should have paid more attention to that. Instead, I kept defending him in my own head because Chloe was happy. Or at least, I desperately thought she was. "Sarah," David squeezed my hand tighter. "I'm serious. We need to go before this starts." That phrase stuck with me later. Before this starts, not before the wedding starts, before this starts. At the time, though, I was too embarrassed to think clearly. People were already staring. One of the caterers nearly bumped into us carrying a tray of champagne glasses. I leaned closer to David. "You are humiliating me right now." His jaw tightened. "I know, but Chloe, she's not safe." The words hit me so hard I actually laughed once out of pure disbelief. "Not safe from what?" "Julian sells luxury real estate, David. He's not Pablo Escobar." David didn't answer immediately. And honestly, that silence scared me more than anything else had all weekend. Because for the first time, my brain stopped making excuses and started replaying the tiny, ugly moments I had blindly ignored over the last few days. I suddenly remembered walking back from the restroom during the rehearsal dinner the night before. I had turned the corner into a dimly lit hallway and frozen. Julian had Chloe pinned against the wall. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't waving his arms. That would have been too obvious, too pedestrian for a Vance. Instead, he was smiling, that same perfect, terrifying, camera-ready smile. But his hand was wrapped around her bare forearm, his fingers digging into her skin so hard his knuckles were stark white. He was leaning in, his lips brushing her ear, whispering with lethal calm, "You will not embarrass me today. Do you understand?" Chloe had just nodded, her eyes wide, entirely vacant, like a hostage praying her captor wouldn't pull the trigger. When they walked back into the dining room seconds later, Julian was holding her hand, kissing her cheek, playing the perfect prince. And Chloe? Chloe had apologized constantly to everybody for the rest of the night. Sorry, the flowers are late. Sorry, the seating cards changed. Sorry. When I watched Chloe line up for the procession today, she didn't look like a bride. She looked like a prisoner walking to the gallows, wrapped in heavy, suffocating layers of expensive silk. The ballroom doors opened across the hallway and the orchestral music swelled louder. The ceremony was seconds away. David looked towards the entrance, then back at me. And for the first time since I'd met him, I saw genuine fear in his face. Not fear for himself, for me. You swear you'll explain? I swallowed hard. Yes. I looked once more toward the bridal suite hallway. For one brief, shattering second, Chloe and I locked eyes through the crowd, and I swear to God she looked relieved to see me leaving, not upset, relieved. David gently but firmly guided me toward the kitchen corridor before guests could stop us. My heels clicked against the old tile floors while cooks shouted over steaming trays. Once we pushed through the heavy swinging service doors, the harbor air felt freezing against my bare shoulders. What the hell is happening? I demanded once we reached the dark parking lot. David opened the passenger door of his truck. Get in first, Sarah. Something in his tone made me stop arguing. The drive out of Charleston was almost completely silent. Rain started halfway across the Ravenel Bridge, soft at first, then driving hard against the windshield. Downtown lights blurred gold across the glass. I sat there twisting my engagement ring so hard my finger throbbed. Finally, David exhaled slowly, keeping his eyes on the slick road. You really didn't notice your sister looked absolutely terrified of him. I stared at him. What are you talking about? There's nervous, he said quietly. And then there's scared to breathe wrong. I know fear, Sarah, and your sister is drowning in it. She's always been emotional, I fired back, anger rising because it was easier than terror. Weddings are stressful. Julian's family is intense. Julian Vance's name has come across my desk at work, David said, his voice dropping to a dead clinical monotone that made my blood run cold. I straightened in my seat, the wet champagne on my dress suddenly freezing against my skin. What conversations? I can't give you full details. It's an active federal investigation, but I couldn't let you stand up there smiling for the cameras. He gripped the steering wheel, the leather creaking under his hands. There are severe financial crimes, massive fraud, and worse, Sarah. Allegations of violent intimidation. Things involving women who tried to leave him. Nothing clean. I stared at him as the truck tore through the rain, the lights of Charleston fading into the absolute dark behind us. Allegations involving women, I repeated, the memory of Julian's bruising grip on Chloe's arm flashing brilliantly and terrifyingly behind my eyes. David just nodded once against the dashboard light. And in that suffocating silence, my entire world broke apart. The next morning, I woke up on David's leather couch with my ruined navy dress hanging over a dining chair like a casualty of war, and a headache sitting behind my eyes like a lead brick. My phone screen was lit up with 22 missed calls. None of them were from Chloe. Most were from our mother's distant cousins I barely spoke to, and there was one voicemail from Aunt Linda that started with, "Sarah, I don't know what kind of selfish, hysterical stunt you pulled last night." I deleted it before she could finish the sentence. I tried calling Chloe. It went straight to voicemail. I texted, "Hey, please call me. I am terrified for you." The message stayed blue for a minute. Then, sickeningly, it turned green. I sat there on the edge of the couch, staring at that little color change longer than a grown woman should. Blocked. My own sister, the woman I had just tried to pull from a burning building, had blocked my number the morning after her wedding. I got up and made coffee because that's what I do when I am one bad thought away from breaking something. Army habits die hard. When your life gets ugly and the world tilts off its axis, you start with something simple. Boil water, measure the grounds, make the bed, check the locks. As the coffee brewed, I leaned against the counter, closing my eyes, and the past bled into the present. When Chloe and I were kids, I protected her from our father as best I could. We lived in a cramped, rotting trailer outside of Columbia back then, before our mother left for good, and our dad started drinking his breakfast out of a stained ceramic mug. I was 16 the night he shoved Chloe against the refrigerator so hard her head bounced off the metal just because she had accidentally spilled a glass of milk. I stepped between them before he could swing again. He hit me instead. He hit me hard enough to crack my lip and leave a bruise that lasted 3 weeks. That became our permanent pattern. Chloe cried. I stood in front. Chloe hid. I took the door slams, the flying plates, the shouting, the ugly words no child should ever have to hear. When I joined the army at 18, part of me thought I was finally escaping him. But a deeper, heavier part of me believed I was just building a fortress, a life strong enough, disciplined enough, that Chloe could hide inside it whenever she needed to. That is a heavy job to give yourself. It is even heavier when nobody asked you to take it. But I had spent my entire life being Chloe's shield, and the brutal realization hitting me in David's kitchen was that my sister had just willingly walked into the arms of a monster who made our father look like an amateur. David came into the kitchen a few minutes later, wearing jeans and a gray t-shirt, his hair still damp from the shower. He looked exhausted. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked quietly. "Do people sleep after ruining weddings?" I countered, staring into my black coffee. "You didn't ruin it, Sarah." David leaned against the island across from me. He hesitated, his dark eyes searching my face. "She went through with it." I looked up, the mug freezing halfway to my mouth. "What?" "They got married last night. A smaller room at the club, private officiant, just immediate family and a few groomsmen. Around 9:30 p.m. For a second, I felt absolutely nothing. Then I felt everything. It was as if somebody had reached into my chest, ripped open a drawer I thought I had deadbolted, and dumped out every old, suffocating fear I had ever known. Chloe hadn't just stayed. She had committed. She had tethered herself to a man who bruised her arms in hallways. But the nightmare was only just beginning. 3 days later, I found out my sister hadn't just married into trouble. She had signed the paperwork for it. That's the part nobody tells you about profound betrayal. It does not always come with dramatic shouting or the sound of breaking glass. Sometimes, it comes in a meticulously scanned PDF attachment with your name spelled correctly at the top. David came over to my house on a Wednesday night. He brought a brown paper bag of barbecue takeout, but he didn't open it. He just set it on the kitchen island and stared at it. That told me more than any FBI briefing ever could. "What?" I asked, my heart rate already climbing. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking older than his 38 years. "Sarah, the Financial Crimes Unit. They pulled the internal routing records for Julian's charity fronts today. I need you to brace yourself." He slid a thick manila folder across the counter. I didn't touch it right away. It felt radioactive. Finally, with shaking hands, I flipped it open. The first page showed a nonprofit logo I recognized immediately. The Jennings Veterans Support Initiative. My nonprofit. My small, boring, painfully honest operation that helped wounded veterans and their families with transportation, wheelchair ramps, and emergency rent bills. We were not fancy. We held pancake breakfasts at local VFW halls and begged local businesses for raffle baskets. And somehow there it was, listed as the primary shell corporation for the Vance Family Patriot Trust. I read the line twice, then a third time, my blood turned to ice. "No," I whispered. "Keep reading," David said softly. I turned the page. There were massive donation totals, millions of dollars, routing references, offshore accounts, wire transfers flowing directly from fraudulent political action committees and fake patriotic charities straight through my nonprofit's tax ID and then disappearing into Julian Vance's private real estate holdings. "How did my nonprofit get on this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "David, I don't have this kind of money. I don't authorize these transfers." David's voice dropped to a devastating whisper. "Look at the signature line on the authorization form, Sarah." I looked down. There it was, Sarah Ann Jennings. But it wasn't my handwriting. It was neat, clean, and tilted slightly to the right. It was my baby sister's handwriting. The exact same loops and crosses I had seen on 100 birthday cards. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter so hard my fingers ached. Chloe forged my name? She didn't just forge your name, David said, stepping closer. Julian is using your military service as a shield. He knows nobody audits a decorated veterans grassroots charity. Millions of dollars have been laundered through your name, Sarah. If this breaks publicly before we can prove coercion, you aren't just looking at a ruined reputation, you are looking at federal prison time. I couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. My sister, my blood, the girl I had taken beatings for. She had handed me over to the wolves to save herself. She wouldn't do this, I gasped, tears finally spilling over my hot cheeks. Julian must have forced her. He must have done it himself. Sarah, David interrupted me. His voice broke. Stop, please. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. His hands weren't perfectly steady either. The Bureau got a wiretap warrant approved for Julian's private office line 2 weeks ago. I wasn't going to play this for you. God knows I didn't want to. But you need to understand exactly what you are dealing with. You need to stop protecting her. He tapped the screen. A distorted, static-filled audio recording filled my quiet kitchen. First, I heard Julian's voice. Cold, silky, terrifyingly calm. The auditors are asking questions about the Carolina transfers, Chloe. We need a firewall, something bulletproof, someone they won't dare investigate. Then the sound of weeping, ragged, panicked crying. It was Chloe. Julian, please. Please don't make me do this. She's my sister. I can't put this on her. Please just put it in my name. I'll take the fall. There was a sickening sound of a chair scraping, followed by a sharp gasp from Chloe, like the air had been violently knocked out of her. You aren't taking the fall for anything, Julian hissed, the mask completely gone. You are my wife, my property. You go down, the Vance name goes down. Sign the goddamn paper, Chloe. Put it on Sarah. She's a soldier, isn't she? She's used to taking a hit. Sign it, or I swear to God you will never leave this house again. The audio captured 10 agonizing seconds of silence, broken only by Chloe's hyperventilating sobs. Then her voice, small, broken, and dripping with ultimate betrayal. Okay, give me the pen. I'll sign her name, just please don't hurt me anymore. Don't. David stopped the recording. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. I collapsed into one of the kitchen chairs, burying my face in my hands. Chloe wasn't just a victim anymore. She was an accomplice. And Julian Vance hadn't just trapped my sister in a gilded cage. He had built a bomb, tied it to my chest, and forced my own sister to light the fuse. By Friday morning, Julian struck first. He didn't just play defense. He waged a scorched earth campaign designed to bury me before I could even find my footing. He posted a long, legally scrubbed statement online through his family's polished public relations firm. It stated, with sickening fake sympathy, that certain estranged family members had attempted to extort the Vance family on their wedding weekend, right as Julian was uncovering severe financial discrepancies within a local veterans charity. He didn't name me explicitly, he didn't have to. By noon, the smear campaign had metastasized. Photos of David and me arguing in the parking lot of the wedding venue were leaked to local tabloids, framed to look like two desperate criminals caught in the act. By dinner time, my life had become a public spectacle. Donors pulled their funding instantly. The polite corporate emails poured in, suspending contributions to the Jennings Veterans Support Initiative, pending a thorough legal clarification. But the public humiliation was only the opening act. The physical intimidation started on Tuesday. I pulled into the gravel lot of my nonprofit's small brick office building in North Charleston to find the front door violently smashed open. Glass littered the welcome mat like crushed ice. Across the interior walls, over the framed photos of soldiers we had helped, someone had used thick, dripping red spray paint to write a single word. Thief. I stood in the center of the ruined office, the smell of fresh aerosol burning my throat, and realized Julian was sending a message. I was no longer fighting a legal battle. I was in a street war with a billionaire. The ultimate gut punch arrived 12 hours later. My phone buzzed with an encrypted email forwarded from my son, Jackson, who was currently deployed with an Army infantry unit overseas. He had received an anonymous, untraceable message to his personal military inbox. It contained a satellite photo of his exact barracks, followed by one sentence. Tell your mother that federal prison is a lot safer than the streets of Charleston. Tell her to drop it. My blood ran completely cold. He was threatening my child. I wanted to drive to Savannah and put a bullet in Julian Vance myself. David had to physically restrain me in my own kitchen, wrapping his arms around me as I screamed and thrashed, consumed by a maternal rage so violent it tasted like copper in my mouth. If you go to him now, he wins, Sarah, David had shouted, holding me tight against his chest. That is exactly what he wants. He wants you to look crazy. He wants you to look dangerous. We do this by the book or you lose everything. I didn't sleep for the next 2 days. I paced my house like a caged animal, jumping at every shadow. That Thursday night, a massive coastal storm slammed into the South Carolina coast. Thunder shook the floorboards of my house, and the rain slashed against the windows like handfuls of gravel. At exactly 2:14 a.m., I heard it. Bang, 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 frantic, desperate knocking at my front door. I grabbed the heavy wooden baseball bat I kept in the umbrella stand. Divorce and trauma change a woman's home security habits, and moved silently down the hallway. I didn't turn on the porch light. I just peered through the side peephole. Lightning flashed, illuminating the porch. I dropped the bat. It hit the hardwood floor with a loud crack as I fumbled with the deadbolt, throwing the door open into the howling wind. Chloe, I gasped. My sister stood there, but she looked like a ghost violently dragged back from the dead. She was completely drenched, her expensive silk dress plastered to her shivering frame, torn at the shoulder. But it was her feet that made my stomach drop. She was barefoot. Her soles were bleeding, leaving faint red footprints on my welcome mat. I pulled her inside and slammed the door shut against the storm, locking it behind us. Oh my God, Chloe, what did he do? I grabbed a towel from the laundry room and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. She felt as fragile as a hollowed-out bird. Her bottom lip was split wide open, the blood already drying, and dark purple bruises bloomed aggressively across her collarbone. She couldn't speak at first. Her teeth were chattering so hard I thought they would crack. I dragged her into the bathroom, turned on the heat lamps, and dropped to my knees to examine her bleeding feet. I looked, she finally stammered, her voice a shredded, unrecognizable whisper. I looked up. You looked at what? His laptop. Chloe gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles white. You were right, Sarah. You were right about everything. He left his briefcase unlocked on Tuesday. I found the flash drives, the offshore routing, the emails where he paid those men to trash your office. I saw the email he sent to Jackson. I saw it all. My heart hammered against my ribs. Chloe, we have to call David. We have to call the police right now. We have the evidence. No! Chloe shrieked, a sound of absolute primal terror. She lunged forward, grabbing my shoulders with shocking strength. He caught me, Sarah. He caught me looking. Tears streamed down her bruised face, mixing with the rainwater. He didn't even yell. He just smiled. And then he dragged me upstairs by my hair. He locked me in the guest suite. 3 days, Sarah. 3 days in the dark. He took my phone. He locked the doors from the outside. He told me I was going to sit in the dark until I learned how to be a loyal wife. I felt physically sick. The air in the bathroom suddenly felt too thin to breathe. How did you get out? I waited until he drank himself to sleep. I broke the glass on the second-story balcony door with a heavy lamp. I climbed down the trellis in the storm. She was hyperventilating now, her eyes wide and manic, scanning my bathroom as if Julian might step out of the shower stall. Okay, baby, you're safe now, I soothed, reaching into my pocket for my phone. I'm calling David. He'll have a tactical team at the Vance estate before sunrise. It's over. No! Chloe slapped the phone out of my hand. It clattered against the tile. You don't understand. If I am not back in that bed before he wakes up, he won't just ruin you, Sarah. He will kill Jackson. He promised me he would have Jackson's unit ambushed. He has the money to do it. You know he does. Chloe, that's insane. The military will— I am going back, she interrupted, her voice dropping to a dead, hollow certainty that terrified me more than her screaming. She let the towel fall to the floor and stepped away from me. "You can't go back!" I yelled, scrambling to my feet to block the bathroom door. "He will kill you! He locked you in a room for 3 days!" "He's my husband," she whispered, a sickening, trauma-bonded glaze washing over her eyes. "I can manage him. If I apologize, if I tell him I just panicked, he'll forgive me. But if I run to you, he will destroy everyone you love. I brought this on you, Sarah. I have to fix it." "Chloe, please." She shoved past me with a violent desperation I couldn't stop without hurting her. She ran down the hallway, unlocking the front door before I could catch her. She threw herself out into the freezing rain, running toward a dark sedan idling down the street, a rideshare she must have called blocks away. "Chloe!" I screamed into the storm, standing barefoot on my porch, but the car door slammed. The taillights bled red into the pouring rain, and she was gone. My sister ran back into the cage to protect me, and I was entirely powerless to stop it. The next 3 days were a blur of suffocating despair. David and the feds were building their case, but white-collar fraud investigations move at a glacial pace, and Julian was moving at the speed of a bullet. But then, the game changed. Not from the FBI, not from a whistleblower, but from the belly of the beast itself. It was a Tuesday evening. I was walking out of a grim fluorescent-lit pharmacy with a bottle of ibuprofen and a desperate need for sleep. The parking lot was nearly empty, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a single street lamp. As I walked toward my car, a sleek, jet-black town car glided out of the shadows and blocked my path. The tinted back window rolled down with a soft, mechanical hum. Sitting in the immaculate leather interior was Eleanor Vance, Julian's mother. She looked exactly like her son. Sharp cheekbones, perfectly tailored designer coat, and eyes completely devoid of human warmth. She was Southern Gothic royalty, a woman who controlled politicians with a whisper and ruined lives before her morning tea. "Get in, Sarah," she said. Her voice wasn't a request, it was a command. I stood my ground in the damp parking lot, clutching my keys between my knuckles. "If you want me dead, Eleanor, you're going to have to do it out here under the cameras." She didn't blink. "If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't have made it out of the pharmacy. Get in." We have exactly 4 minutes before my son's private security realizes my car went off route. Something in her voice, a jagged edge of urgency beneath the ice, made me open the heavy door and slide onto the plush seat opposite her. The car smelled like expensive leather and cold perfume. Eleanor didn't offer pleasantries. She opened her pristine Chanel clutch and pulled out a small, heavy silver object. She placed it on the armrest between us. It was an encrypted flash drive. "My son," Eleanor began, her voice dropping to a frigid, calculated register, "has become a liability." I stared at the flash drive, then at her. "You're turning on him?" "I am protecting the Vance name," she corrected sharply. "Julian's father was a cruel man, but he was a quiet one. Julian is sloppy. He is arrogant. And his obsession with breaking your sister is drawing federal eyes to our family's entire portfolio. I will not allow a century of wealth to be dismantled because my son cannot control his temper or his illicit ledgers." I felt a sickening twist in my gut. She didn't care that Julian beat my sister. She cared that it was bad for business. "What's on the drive?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Everything," Eleanor said coldly. "The unredacted shell company ledgers, the direct wire transfers, the recordings of his bribes, and medical records." "Medical records?" Eleanor's eyes locked onto mine, and for a fraction of a second I saw the ghost of a mother's regret before it was ruthlessly buried again. "You think Chloe is the first woman he has done this to? Julian's previous fiancé didn't just leave for Europe, Sarah. He drove her to a complete psychological breakdown. He institutionalized her to keep her quiet. The admission papers signed by him are on that drive." I felt the blood drain from my face. "Take it," Eleanor commanded, gesturing to the silver drive. "Give it to your FBI fiancé. Take my son down. Burn him to the ground before he takes us all with him." I slowly reached out and picked up the cold metal drive. "And Chloe? What happens to her when this blows up?" Eleanor Vance looked away, staring out the tinted window into the dark parking lot. "Collateral damage is inevitable in a war, Sarah. I suggest you tell your sister to pack a very small bag. The window rolled up, leaving me standing alone in the cold, holding the weapon that would either save my family or destroy us all. 2 weeks. That is exactly how long it took David's federal cybercrimes unit to fully decrypt, verify, and build a bulletproof indictment out of the files on Eleanor Vance's silver flash drive. 14 days of agonizing, suffocating silence. Julian thought he had won. He thought I was cowering in my house, financially ruined and paralyzed by the threats against my son. He had no idea we were simply loading the weapon his own mother had handed us. The night of the Winter Patriot Gala arrived with a bitter, biting cold that swept off the Atlantic. Savannah looked like a dark, glittering postcard that someone wealthy had paid extra to perfectly arrange. Historic buildings glowed with warm gold lighting. Horse-drawn carriages clattered over the cobblestones downtown, and ancient oak trees dripping with Spanish moss were wrapped in pristine white Christmas lights. Back in my quiet bedroom, I stood in front of my mirror and slipped on my armor. Chloe had been right about the navy dress. I hadn't worn it since the rehearsal dinner, but tonight it was exactly what I needed. I smoothed my hands over the fabric, instinctively noting the garment's precise construction. It was a masterpiece of understated design, a bias-cut silk crepe that draped naturally and fluidly over my frame. There was no restrictive boning, no heavy, suffocating tulle, and absolutely zero embellishments. It was a dress built for a woman who needed to move freely, to breathe deeply, to fight. I applied a single coat of dark red lipstick, grabbed my clutch, and drove alone into the lion's den. David was already there, but we couldn't be seen together. He was on the clock tonight. The Savannah Grand Hotel's main ballroom was a towering monument to oppressive wealth. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted, frescoed ceilings. Waiters in immaculate white coats glided through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne and caviar. It was a room full of old money, trying very, very hard to look charitable. The moment I pushed through the heavy double oak doors, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet 10 degrees. The whispers started almost immediately. I was the pariah. I was the disgraced veteran, the thief who had supposedly stolen from her own brothers and sisters in arms to fund a lavish lifestyle. I could feel the heat of their judgmental stares burning into my back, but I kept my spine ramrod straight. I walked toward a high-top table near the center of the room, ordered a club soda, and waited. Then I saw them. Julian and Chloe were holding court near a massive, intricately carved ice sculpture. Julian looked flawless in a bespoke, razor-sharp tuxedo, shaking hands with a local senator, flashing that perfect, practiced smile. But my eyes immediately locked onto my little sister. If my dress was built for breathing, Chloe was entombed in haute couture. Julianne had dressed her in a heavy, emerald green velvet ball gown that looked incredibly expensive and utterly agonizing to wear. The bodice was rigidly structured, tightly laced to restrict her waist, while the thick, pearl-encrusted straps dug visibly and painfully into her bruised collarbones. A massive, ostentatious diamond necklace sat tightly at her throat like a glittering collar. She didn't look like a glowing high society wife. She looked like a spectacularly tailored captive. Her posture was stiff, her hands clutching a beaded purse so hard her knuckles were white. Her eyes were hollow, scanning the room with the frantic, exhausted energy of a hunted animal. Julian's hand was resting on the small of her back. To the crowd, it looked like a gesture of affection. But from 30 feet away, I could see his fingers gripping the heavy velvet fabric, anchoring her to his side by sheer force. Julian turned his head and his eyes met mine through the crowd. For a fraction of a second, his perfect mask slipped. A flicker of genuine shock crossed his face, followed instantly by a dark, simmering rage. He leaned down, whispering something into Chloe's ear. She went completely rigid, her eyes snapping toward me. She looked terrified. Julian smoothly excused himself from the senator and glided across the ballroom floor, closing the distance between us. He stopped just inches from my face, his cologne smelling like expensive cedar and cold arrogance. "Sarah," he said smoothly, keeping his voice perfectly modulated for the surrounding guests. "I must admit I am stunned you have the sheer audacity to show your face here tonight. Security will be escorting you out before the first course is served." I took a slow sip of my club soda, meeting his dead eyes. "I wouldn't worry about me, Julian. You should probably focus on your keynote speech. I hear it's going to be unforgettable." A tiny muscle ticked in his jaw. He smiled, a terrifying baring of teeth. "You have no idea what you are playing with, you pathetic, washed-up soldier. I'm going to bury you so deep you won't even—" "Julian!" a wealthy donor interrupted, clapping him heartily on the shoulder. "There's the man of the hour! We need a photo by the trust display." Julian instantly snapped back into character, his terrifying sneer vanishing into a warm southern grin. He gave me one last venomous look before allowing himself to be pulled away. 40 excruciating minutes later, the dinner plates were cleared and the ballroom lights dimmed. The crowd grew quiet as Julian stepped onto the brightly lit stage. The massive, high-definition projector screens behind him displayed an enormous American flag softly waving in the wind. He tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, honored guests, tonight we gather not just to celebrate the season, but to honor the profound, sacred concept of sacrifice." I stood near the back of the room, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. I looked across the sea of seated guests and found David standing by the side exit, an earpiece securely in his right ear. He gave me a single, barely perceptible nod. "My family," Julian continued, his voice echoing powerfully through the room, "believes deeply in protecting those who have given everything for our freedom. Integrity, duty, honor. These are not just words to the Vance family, they are our foundation." He raised a crystal champagne glass. "To our heroes." Click. The massive screens behind Julian flickered, glitching violently. The soft, patriotic orchestral music suddenly cut out with a harsh, ear-piercing screech of audio feedback. Several guests covered their ears. Julian frowned, turning his head toward the tech booth. "Apologies, folks. It seems we have a small—" He froze. The American flag was gone. In its place, projected 50 feet wide for the entire Savannah elite to see, were the unredacted offshore routing documents from Eleanor's Drive. The headers were highlighted in bright, screaming yellow. Vance Family Patriot Trust, Unauthorized Wire Transfer, Cayman Holdings, LLC. But numbers are boring. Spreadsheets are confusing to a crowd that has just consumed 3 glasses of vintage wine. The real kill shot wasn't visual. It was auditory. The tech operator backstage, a federal agent who had quietly relieved the actual hotel employee 10 minutes prior, hit the play button on the audio file David had extracted from the wiretap. Julian's recorded voice suddenly boomed through the state-of-the-art surround sound system. It wasn't the polished Southern gentleman the crowd had just applauded. It was the monster. "The auditors are asking questions about the Carolina transfers, Chloe. We need a firewall. Sign the goddamn paper, Chloe." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the ballroom. Julian dropped his champagne glass. It shattered against the stage floor, the sound sharp like a gunshot. He spun around, staring up at his own damning words, his face draining of all color. Then came Chloe's recorded voice, echoing off the crystal chandeliers, weeping with primal terror. "Please, please don't hurt me anymore." And Julian's terrifying, vicious response. "You are my wife, my property. You go down, the Vance name goes down. Sign it or I swear to God you will never leave this house again." Total, absolute chaos erupted. The ballroom shattered into pandemonium. Wealthy donors leaped to their feet, shouting in confusion and horror. Chairs scraped violently against the floor. An older veteran in a dress uniform near the front slammed his fists on his table, screaming, "Are those our funds? Are those the charity accounts?" Julian Vance lost his mind entirely. The polished veneer of the billionaire heir violently ripped away, leaving only a cornered, rabid animal. He screamed at the tech booth, "Turn it off! Cut the power! Cut the goddamn power!" But the audio looped. playing his threats over and over again while the screens cycled through forged signatures, illegal payoffs, and the medical intake forms of his institutionalized ex-fiancé. Julian's wild, panicked eyes scanned the chaotic ballroom, and then, through the sea of shouting, standing guests, his eyes locked onto me. I was standing perfectly still in the back, watching his empire burn. Pure, unadulterated rage mutated his face. He didn't care about the cameras, he didn't care about the donors. He leaped off the front of the stage, shoving a 60-year-old woman out of his way, and charged straight down the center aisle toward me. His hands were curled into white-knuckled fists. "I'll kill you!" Julian roared, his voice tearing over the din of the panicked crowd. "You bitch, I will kill you!" I didn't move an inch, I didn't flinch. He made it exactly 15 feet down the aisle before reality hit him like a freight train. David materialized from the shadows, moving with terrifying speed. He didn't issue a warning. He hit Julian at a full sprint, driving his shoulder squarely into Julian's chest. The impact lifted Julian off his feet. They crashed into a lavishly set dining table, shattering crystal centerpieces, plates, and wine glasses in a spectacular explosion of glass and floral arrangements. Instantly, 6 other men in dark suits, federal agents who had been posing as waiters and guests, swarmed the wreckage. "FBI, stay on the ground, do not move!" Julian fought like a madman, screaming obscenities, bleeding from a cut on his forehead where he had hit the table. But David pinned his arm behind his back with ruthless professional force, slapping the heavy steel cuffs onto his wrists. The sharp click of the metal ratcheting tight was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Flashbulbs erupted. People had their phones out, recording the golden boy of Savannah being dragged up from the ruined table, his tuxedo ripped, his face smeared with blood and cake, screaming wildly as agents hauled him toward the service doors. Through the deafening noise, the flashing lights, and the screaming crowd, the sea of people parted for just a moment. I looked toward the front of the room. Chloe was standing near the shattered remains of the stage. The heavy emerald velvet of her dress seemed to drag her down, the pearls choking her. But as she watched Julian being physically dragged out of the room, something in her face finally broke. She wasn't looking at him anymore, she was looking at me. Slowly, her legs gave out. Chloe collapsed to her knees right there on the ballroom floor. She buried her face in her hands, and even from across the room I could see her shoulders shaking. She was weeping, not in fear, not in sorrow. She was crying the heavy, exhausted, earth-shattering tears of a prisoner who had just watched the heavy iron gates of her cell swing wide open. 6 months after the flashing cameras faded and the shattered crystal was swept off the Savannah Grand's ballroom floor, I finally learned what the silence after a war actually sounds like. It doesn't sound like victory, it just sounds like exhaustion. Julian Vance was denied bail. He remained locked in a federal detention center in Atlanta, awaiting a trial he would inevitably lose. Eleanor Vance had kept her word. She handed the prosecutors enough unredacted ledgers, offshore routing numbers, and recorded threats to bury her own son for decades, cleanly severing him from the family empire before vanishing back into the shadows of high society. The criminal charges of massive wire fraud, money laundering, and witness intimidation were ironclad. My name and the name of my nonprofit were fully cleared by the Department of Justice. The spray paint was scrubbed off our brick office walls. Some of the donors came back, apologizing profusely for doubting me. Some didn't. I eventually realized I was okay with that. Trust is a heavy thing to rebuild, and I no longer had the energy to beg anyone to believe in my integrity. David and I survived too, though there were weeks I genuinely wasn't sure we would. When you spend months living inside a state of pure adrenaline-fueled terror, the sudden absence of it leaves you strangely hollow. We didn't fight about the case anymore. We snapped at each other over burnt toast, unanswered texts, and the lingering, suffocating trauma that had essentially moved into my house and claimed the spare bedroom. But David never packed his bags. He stayed through the nightmares, the sudden panic attacks, and the long, silent dinners until the ghost of Julian Vance finally started to fade from our kitchen. When my son Jackson finally came home on leave from Germany, he walked through my front door, dropped his heavy green duffel bag, and wrapped me in a hug so tight my spine popped. He had grown an inch, his shoulders broader, his face older. He held on to me for a long time in the hallway, and for the first time in my life, I let my child hold me up instead of the other way around. But the final piece of the wreckage took longer to face. It was mid-April when I finally made the drive up the coast to a sleepy, salt-washed town in North Carolina to see my sister. Chloe had taken a federal plea deal by fully cooperating with the FBI, wearing a wire during her final days in the Vance estate, and testifying to the grand jury about the forged documents. She avoided prison time. But she couldn't return to Charleston, and Savannah was entirely out of the question. So she packed a single suitcase and disappeared into a quiet, remarkably ordinary life. I pulled my car into the cracked asphalt driveway of a small, faded blue duplex a few blocks from the beach. There were no wrought iron gates, no private security details, just a rusty bicycle leaning against the porch and wind chimes rattling softly in the sea breeze. The front screen door opened. Chloe stepped out onto the wooden porch, and the visual contrast from the last time I had seen her actually made my breath catch. Gone were the heavy, suffocating velvets, the rigid corsetry, and the glittering diamond collars Julian had used to chain her to his side. Instead, she was wearing a simple, breezy two-piece set, a light, strapless cotton top paired with a flowing, soft linen skirt that moved easily in the coastal wind. She had slipped on a pair of simple, flat shoes with absolutely no straps, laces, or buckles to bind her feet. Her hair wasn't perfectly styled into a rigid updo. It was loose, messy, and tangled with sea salt. She looked completely, beautifully unburdened. She looked like she was finally breathing oxygen instead of exhaust fumes. "Hey," she said softly, her voice carrying a fragile, cautious hope. "Hey yourself," I replied, walking up the wooden steps. We sat on her small patio for hours, drinking cheap iced tea from plastic cups. She told me about her new job working as a receptionist at a local dental clinic. She told me how she had to learn how to budget for groceries, how to pay her own electric bill, how to navigate a world where money wasn't an endless, weaponized resource. "I'm sorry," she whispered suddenly, staring down at the condensation pooling around the base of her cup. "For what I did. For what I almost let him do to you. I was just so terrified of him, Sarah. I forgot how to be a person." I reached across the small wicker table and covered her hand with mine. The bruising on her wrists was completely gone, leaving nothing but pale, unblemished skin. "I know, Chloe, I know you were." "Do you think you can ever forgive me?" she asked, tears finally welling in her eyes. "I already have," I told her, and I was entirely shocked to realize it was the absolute truth. "But we can't ever go back to the way we were. I can't be your shield anymore, Chloe. You have to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet." She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes, a genuine quiet strength settling over her features. "I am. I promise I am." The next morning, before I drove back to Charleston, I walked down to the beach by myself. The sun was just starting to crest over the dark Atlantic, bleeding brilliant streaks of violent pink and soft gold into the clouds. The water was steel gray and rough, crashing rhythmically against the shoreline. I stood at the edge of the surf, the freezing water washing over my bare feet, and dug my hand into my jacket pocket. My fingers brushed against the cold silver chain of a bracelet. It was a delicate silver sand dollar. Chloe had given it to me years ago, right after my divorce, during one of the darkest, loneliest periods of my adult life. For years, I had worn it like a badge of honor, a symbol of our unbreakable, fiercely codependent bond. I turned the small silver charm over between my thumb and forefinger, watching it catch the early morning light. For 40 years, I had fundamentally misunderstood what it meant to love my sister. I thought loving someone meant standing between them and every bad decision they ever made. I thought it meant taking the hits meant for them. I thought it meant being the armor they refused to wear. But that kind of love is a trap. It doesn't save them. It just slowly drowns you both. You can love someone with every fiber of your being, you can ache for their safety, and you can still absolutely refuse to follow them into their own destruction. It had cost me my reputation, my peace of mind, and nearly my freedom to finally learn the difference between saving someone and carrying them. I took a deep breath, the cold salt air filling my lungs, expanding my chest. I pulled my arm back and threw the silver bracelet as hard as I could. I watched it arc gracefully through the dawn light before it disappeared silently into the churning, endless gray ocean. I didn't throw it away out of anger. I didn't throw it out of punishment or bitterness or grief. I threw it away because for the first time in my entire life, my hands were finally empty, and I was ready to go home.